Young, and the Restless spoilers Monday full episodes February to 2026. In Genoa City, panic never arrives as a single event, it arrives as a chain reaction. The kind that begins quietly in private rooms and then spreads through text messages, police scanners, security feeds, and the half-controlled hysteria of families who realize that money cannot purchase certainty. When a child is missing, while the city's public face tried to remain polished at business meetings still scheduled, restaurants still open, people still pretending their lives were normal and uglier current moved underneath, driven by one name that carried too many legacies to be taken lightly. Dominic Newman Abbott Winter's Chancellor. Every branch of that hyphenated identity meant another circle of people searching, another set of resources mobilized, another set of emotions boiling into something dangerous. Abby Winters was living inside that danger, a mother held upright by adrenaline and denial. And when she received a new clue, it did not feel like hope so much as a razor-thin bridge over a cliff. The hint didn't arrive with the comfort of clarity. It arrived with the violence of possibility. It suggested movement, a pattern. A human mistake something that proved Dominic was still out there, and that whoever had taken him was not perfectly invisible. Abby's mind grabbed onto that clue the way a drowning person grabs onto wood, because she could not afford to consider the alternative. Yet even as she focused on the practical step show to verify it, how to connect it to a location, how to use it without tipping off the wrong people, her body betrayed her with tremors of exhaustion, because grief and fear had been draining her for days. She had become a woman who measured time not in hours, but in fragments of breath, who felt every moment of waiting like a deliberate act of cruelty. The clue sharpened her resolve, but also sharpened her guilt, because she knew this crisis was not just about a kidnapper in the shadows. It was about manipulation, about someone steering events from above, and about the terrifying possibility that the person holding Dominic was not acting alone. Somewhere behind the chaos, strings were being pulled, and Abby could sense that the next move would demand an emotional cost she might not be able to pay. At the same time, another storm was forming in a different part of Town that did not revolve around search grids or hospital-grade fear, but round confrontation, accusation, and the kind of personal collision that can ignite a larger fire. Sharon Newman, who had spent enough of her life surviving trauma to recognize the scent of something rotten in the air, found herself forced into a face-to-face reckoning. Sharon's strength had never been about physical dominance. It had always been about endurance, about the stubborn refusal to be erased by whatever darkness tried to claim her. When she confronted Summian weather, it was a person, a situation, or an ugly truth. She did it with the intensity of someone who had learned that silence can be weaponized against you. And right now, silence was everywhere, in the unanswered questions about Dominic, in the vague explanations people were giving each other to avoid panic, in the gaps that were widening between what Genoa City believed and what was actually happening. Sharon's confrontation carried the weight of those gaps. It wasn't just about anger. It was about the instinctive horror that someone had turned a child into a chess piece, and that the city's familiar villains were not as gone as everyone wanted to believe. Sharon had seen what charismatic monsters could do when given the chance to rewrite reality, and she could feel the outline of one of those monsters moving again, using faith, fear, and psychological pressure the way other men used money. She didn't need a full confession to know what she was up against. She only needed the pattern, the manipulation, the isolation, the attempt to bend a vulnerable person into a tool. Sharon's confrontation was the kind that could either break a fragile alliance or force the truth into the light. But in Genoa City, the truth rarely comes without consequences. When Sharon pushed, she risked becoming a target. When she demanded answers, She risked triggering a retaliation. Still, she did it. Because for Sharon, the worst thing in the world was not a fight, it was letting evil operate, unchallenged. And in the center of this widening crisis, Mariah Copeland was on the move again, dragging a terrified little boy through an increasingly unstable landscape of lies. Mariah was hiding with Dominic in a lodge near Genoa City, a place that had initially felt like a clever compromise close. Enough to remain within reach of instructions, remote enough to avoid immediate detection, ordinary enough to blend into the background of weekend travelers. The problem with temporary safety is that it deteriorates quickly. Once the world starts looking in the right direction, Mariah understood that the lodge was not a sanctuary. It was a countdown. With every hour that passed, the odds shifted against her. The search for Dominic was growing more sophisticated, more relentless, and more emotional, which meant mistakes would be made by both sides. Mariah did not have the luxury of believing she could remain invisible forever. She was not a faceless kidnapper. She was a recognizable woman from a prominent family network. And even if she tried to keep her head down, some detail would betray her. It was already happening. There was a scarf, something small, almost laughably ordinary. It was the kind of personal item that can become a signature. Once investigators and desperate relatives begin scanning every possibility, if someone connected that scarf to Mariah, the search would narrow violently. Her face would be everywhere, printed, posted, shared, analyzed, turned into a public symbol of betrayal. Mariah could picture it with sick clarity. Her photo on screens, her name in headlines. The speculation of strangers who would not know her pain, but would happily judge it. And once she became a visible target, the lodge would become a trap. People would search every nearby road, question every clerk, trace every purchase, examine every camera feed. The walls would close in, and Dominic would be pulled into an even more dangerous escalation. That was why Ian Ward's influence mattered so much. Because Mariah wasn't simply making choices under stress. She was following a script imposed by a man who understood how to fracture someone from the inside. Ian had not guided her with direct physical force. He had guided her with the kind of psychological engineering that turns fear into obedience, and obedience into a new identity. Mariah had become both prisoner and instrument, convinced that movement was survival, and that hesitation would mean catastrophe. Ian's instructions were not suggestions. They were the rails of a train she could not stop. If he warned her that they needed to relocate before the police closed in, it wouldn't come from concern. It would come from strategy. Ian did not care about Mariah's comfort or Dominic's emotional stability. He cared about control, about keeping the narrative in his hands, about proving that he could still reach into Genoa City and bend its most powerful families into helplessness. A man like Ian thrives on the spectacle of panic, but he thrives even more on the private knowledge that he orchestrated it. The lodge was never meant to be permanent, and Ian would know exactly when to yank Mariah out of it, when to force her into another hiding place, another set of risks, another layer of dependency. With every move, he would isolate her further from any version of her old self that might still be fighting to surface. The cruelest part was Dominic's growing awareness, because children are far more perceptive than adults want to admit. And Dominic's entire world had been disrupted in a way his mind could not fully process. In the beginning, Mariah's lies had been simple, almost gentle in their intent. Abby and Devin were late. Abby and Devin would come soon. Everything would go back to normal. Those words bought time. But time is not infinite when a child's heart is pulling him toward the people he trusts. Dominic kept asking, not because he wanted to torture Mariah, but because the absence of his parents was a wound that kept bleeding. Every question was a small act of hope. And every time Mariah dodged it, she felt that hope turning into confusion. Dominic's longing did not fade, it intensified. He wanted to know when he would see Abby again, when Devin would pick him up, why the room they were in did not smell like home, why everything felt wrong. Mariah tried to distract him with routines, with snacks, with television, with small games that might make him forget the passage of time. But she could not distract him from the primal truth that he had been taken away. And that truth lived in the quiet moments when he stared at the door as if expecting it to open. The more he asked, the more Mariah felt her own stability cracking. Because every question forced her to confront what she was doing not as a mission, but as harm. She had told herself she was protecting him in some twisted way. That she was following orders for a reason she could not fully explain. That if she just did what Ian demanded, the nightmare would end. But Dominic's questions stripped away the illusion. They made her see herself through the eyes of a child who only understood loss. Ian's response to that emotional pressure was as calculated as it was vicious. He did not want Dominic to remain anchored to Abby and Devin because that anchor was a threat. As long as Dominic believed his parents were coming, he would resist bonding with Mariah in the way Ian needed. The boy's hope was a kind of rebellion, an inner refusal to accept the new reality being forced upon him. Ian understood that to fully control a situation, you must break the victim's expectation of rescue. That is why he ordered Mariah to tell Dominic something monstrous, that Abby and Devin did not want him anymore. The instruction was not just cruel, it was strategic. If Dominic believed he had been abandoned, his grief would turn inward. He would stop asking when he would go home because he would start believing home had rejected him. That belief would make him more malleable, easier to move, easier to hide, easier to use as a pawn without constant emotional resistance. Ian wasn't just kidnapping a child, he was attempting to rewrite the child's emotional map, to sever trust and replace it with a new dependency. And Mariah, trapped under Ian's influence, stood at the edge of that order like a woman being asked to commit a spiritual crime. The moment Mariah understood what Ian demanded, something inside her recoiled with real terror, not the fear of being caught, but the fear of what it would do to Dominic and to her own soul. She had already crossed lines she never believed she would cross. But this was different. This was not logistics. This was not hiding. This was psychological violence. She could feel the words forming like poison in her mouth, and she hated herself for even imagining speaking them. Yet she also knew Ian's power over her was not theoretical. His control lived in the threats he had planted in her mind, in the consequences he had promised, in the way he had twisted her vulnerabilities until she could barely tell where her own will ended. And his began. Ian had made himself the only authority in her universe. To disobey him felt like stepping off a cliff. Mariah tried to bargain with herself. She told herself she could soften the message, make it sound temporary, make it sound like a misunderstanding. She told herself she could delay, give Dominic more time before crushing him. But Ian's influence didn't permit delay. Ian's whole strategy depended on urgency, on preventing Mariah from thinking too long, on keeping her in motion and in fear. And Dominic, sensing the change in her energy, sensing the tension that tightened her face, grew more restless, more insistent, because children could feel when adults are lying even when they don't understand why. Mariah could see the moment coming like a slow car crash, Dominic asking again, and her being forced either to break him with the truth Ian wanted, or to risk everything by refusing. Meanwhile, Abby's clue pushed her forward in a way that made the whole town feel like it was tightening. She was no longer wandering in pure uncertainty. She had a thread to pull. Even if she didn't yet know how reliable it was, it gave her something to build around. And in crisis, even a fragile structure feels like a lifeline. Abby's mind began connecting dots with a fierce maternal precision. She replayed timelines. She questioned every earlier assumption. She looked back at any behavior that had felt off, any absence, any person who had seemed to calm or to conveniently uninvolved. The clue suggested that the hiding place was not random. It suggested the involvement of someone with knowledge of backroads, private rentals, quiet spaces near the city. Abby's fear evolved into focus, and focus gave her a kind of cold strength. She wasn't simply reacting anymore. She was hunting. And when a mother begins hunting in Genoa City, she doesn't do it alone for long. Devon would be drawn into her urgency, not only by love for Dominic, but by the unbearable idea that their child was being emotionally tortured while they stood powerless. Every minute that passed increased the chance that Dominic would be told the lie, that his parents didn't want him, and Abby could sense, even without knowing the details, that the longer this dragged on, the deeper the psychological damage would become. Her clue, therefore, wasn't just a path to a location. It was a race against a specific kind of cruelty. Sharon's confrontation also fed into that race, because Sharon's instincts were rarely wrong when darkness was trying to return under a new mask. She had a history with manipulation that left scars you cannot explain away, and she recognized the pattern of a predator trying to reassert control. If Sharon pushed hard enough, she could destabilize Ian's strategy. She could force someone to admit what they knew, or she could provoke a reaction that revealed a hidden connection. Sharon was not a detective by title, but trauma can teach you to read people like evidence. She knew when someone's story didn't match their eyes. She knew when fear was too specific to be innocent. And she knew that sometimes saving a child meant breaking through adult denial with blunt force. Her confrontation, therefore, was not just emotional drama. It was pressure applied to the weak point of a larger scheme. Sharon understood that the longer Ian remained in the shadows, the stronger he became, because he thrived on being underestimated. So she confronted, risking backlash, because she had lived long enough to know that fear unchallenged becomes control. Back at the lodge, Mariah's need to move became inevitable. The more she imagined the police tracing the scarf, the more she felt the walls breathing closer. Even ordinary sounds began to feel like threats. Footsteps in the hallway, a car door outside, a knock down the corridor that wasn't meant for her but still made her stomach lurch. She checked windows obsessively. She watched the parking lot with the paranoia of a fugitive. Dominic's presence amplified everything because he was not just a burden to hide. He was a living reminder of what she had done. Every time he looked at her with trust her with confusion, she felt a sharp, aching guilt that made her want to confess and collapse. Yet she couldn't, because confession would not simply free her. It would expose Dominic to chaos. It would trigger a chase. It would provoke Ian. So she stayed in the lie, and the lie grew heavier, pressing down on her chest until it became hard to breathe. When Ian's instruction, "Can move now," before they find you, it landed on her like both relief and doom. Relief because movement meant postponement. Postponement of being caught. Postponement of facing Dominic's questions in a stable environment. Postponement of the moment when the lodge became a cage. Doom because moving meant entering uncertainty again, stepping into riskier terrain, dragging Dominic through yet another upheaval. Mariah told herself that once she moved, she would find a way to fix this, to protect Dominic, to somehow break free of Ian's grip. But deep down she feared she was past the point of fixing anything. She feared she was only choosing between different versions of disaster. Dominic's questions kept coming, and with each one, Mariah's lies began to sound thinner, less believable even to her own ears. She could see the child's patience fraying into fear. He did not understand adult manipulation. He only understood abandonment as a sensation creeping into his bones. Mariah tried to keep her voice calm, tried to keep her face soft, tried to give him reassurances that would not completely unravel under scrutiny. But she could not give him what he needed, the certainty of his parents' arms. Dominic's longing became sharper, almost frantic, and that longing was the one force capable of cracking Ian's influence over Mariah, because it appealed to the part of her that was still human. Yet Ian's order about telling Dominic the terrible lie hovered like a knife. Mariah began to realize the real purpose of that lie was not just to control Dominic. It was to break her. If she spoke those words to a child, she would cross a moral boundary that would make it harder for her to return. She would become the villain in Dominic's story. She would carry that stain forever. And Ian would own her even more completely because she would believe she didn't deserve redemption. That was Ian's artistry. He didn't just control people through fear. He controlled them through complicity, by forcing them to harm others so they could no longer see themselves as capable of being good. As the night stretched on, Genoa City felt like it was approaching a tipping point. Abby's clue threatened to narrow the search to a manageable scope, which meant the people hiding Dominic would have to act faster. Sharon's confrontation threatened to shake loose information, which meant Ian would have to tighten his grip. Mariah's relocation threatened to increase the risk of exposure, because movement creates footprints, and footprints can be followed. Dominic's emotional persistence threatened to undermine the entire psychological plan, because a child's love for his parents can be stubbornly indestructible. All these elements pressed together, creating a sense that the next day would not simply continue the story, it would escalate it. And at the center of that escalation sat Mariah, the most fragile link in Ian's chain, holding Dominic's hand while trying to hold herself together. She was a woman on the edge of a breakdown, forced to choose between obeying a monster and listening to her own conscience. Forced to move like a criminal while still wanting to be seen as someone worth saving. Dominic, innocent and exhausted, clung to the one truth he could still feel, that his parents loved him. Abby, armed with a clue, clung to the one certainty that gave her strength, that she would not stop until her son was back. In her arms, Sharon, burning with protective fury, clung to the one principle that had kept her alive through her own darkness. You confront evil, even when it scares you, because letting it grow in silence is worse. The question looming over everything was not whether Genoa City would find Dominic. It was what Dominic would believe by the time they did, and who Mariah would become in the moment before rescue finally arrived. At the Chancellor estate, the silence felt heavier than it ever had before. Not the dignified quiet of old money and tradition, but the suffocating stillness that settles in when a family is bracing for bad news. Abby Winters moved through the grand rooms with restless purpose, her steps echoing softly against polished floors that suddenly felt too large, too empty. This house had always represented legacy and power, a place where generations had lived, argued, loved, and survived. Now it felt like a hollow shell, a backdrop for fear that refused to be soothed. Abby's exhaustion clung to her like a second skin, but she forced herself to stay sharp, because mothers do not get the luxury of collapse when their children are missing. Every detail mattered. Every misplaced object became a possible answer. That was how she found it, almost by accident, tucked where it didn't belong, as if it had been dropped in haste or forgotten in a moment of panic. The scarf lay there quietly, deceptively ordinary, its presence easy to overlook unless you were already searching with desperation in your bones. Abby picked it up slowly, her fingers brushing the fabric as a chill crept up her spine. She knew this house intimately. She knew the staff. She knew what belonged here and what did not. And this scarf did not belong to anyone who lived or worked at the Chancellor estate. It was out of place, a foreign thread in a carefully maintained order. And that alone was enough to make her pulse race. Abby did not yet recognize it as Mariah's, but instinct told her it was connected, that it was a breadcrumb left behind by chaos rather than carelessness. She held onto it like a fragile clue, aware that even the smallest oversight could mean the difference between finding Dominic and losing him forever. The discovery did not bring relief so much as it brought urgency, because a clue is only valuable if it leads somewhere. Abby's mind immediately began racing through possibilities, reconstructing timelines, imagining paths that someone might have taken in and out of this house without drawing attention. The scarf suggested movement, suggested proximity, suggested that Dominic had been closer than anyone realized. It ignited a terrible mixture of hope and dread. Because if Dominic had been near enough to leave something behind, then he had also been close enough to be moved again just as quickly. Abby knew better than to celebrate too early. She had lived in Genoa City long enough to understand that hope here often comes sharpened with pain. And almost as if the universe wanted to reinforce that lesson, another piece of information surfaced, carried in hurried conversations and frantic calls. Someone had reported seeing a small boy matching Dominic's description, with a woman at a nearby lodge, a modest place just outside the city where people come and go without leaving much of a trace. For a moment, Abby allowed herself to breathe, because this was more than speculation. This was a sighting. This was confirmation that Dominic was alive, that he was moving, that he was still within reach. But that breath caught painfully in her chest when she and the others arrived at the lodge, only to find it empty, as if Dominic and the woman with him had dissolved into the air moments before help arrived.